Hi folks, David Jamieson here, editor of Conter.co.uk, and I'm joined once again by Les Huckfield, among many other things, a former UK government minister under a Labour government. He's also been an MP and an MEP and politically active over many years. Some of you may have seen our last video. We were discussing the crisis of Scottish democracy around the Holyrood inquiry. And I wanted to bring Les back to discuss how the inquiry went down and how we move out of its shadow, I suppose. So Les, thanks very much for joining me again.
Thanks for having me. Thank you for inviting me.
Now, in our first interview, we worried, I suppose, that the evidence sessions where Salmond and Sturgeon would supply their evidence to the inquiry might see a peak in the sort of depoliticised, highly personalised culture around the inquiry, and the very personalised way of looking at the contemporary political situation in Scotland. I mean, I think those worries were borne out, basically. I mean, how did you think the atmosphere was around the Salmond and Sturgeon evidence sessions?
Well, let me say quite candidly, and I'm going to avoid taking sides, but I think that Alex Salmond's presentation was far more comprehensive. In fact, it was a masterclass in giving evidence to something like that. So, I mean, of the two, despite the fact that Nicola was on stage, if you like, for a longer period, I thought that in terms of producing evidence and in terms of raising causes for concern, I thought that Alex was more plausible. But I mean, I'm not going to take sides because my worry is this. In depicting this at all as a kind of personal thing between Nicola and Alex Salmond, which I'm very sure is the way that she would prefer to portray it. Indeed, that's the way that she was really trying to make it come across at her evidence last Wednesday. But in trying to portray this as just some kind of personal battle or personal battle for survival, if you like, or some kind of contest to see whether Nicola will survive, which is the way in which it's been portrayed by a lot of the mainstream media, I think that totally misses the point, utterly misses the point. I think we really are approaching crisis proportions in democracy in Scotland. I think we are already overdue with accountability crisis in Scotland. But underneath all of that, I mean, the policy agenda, particularly for progressive policies in Scotland, isn't moving forward at all. So really on top of this, on top of the sort of political paralysis that we've got, and it's enabling Scotland's ruling elite, if you like, to become even more ensconced in their positions, on top of the sort of democracy and accountability crisis that we've already got. I certainly think that we've got a policy crisis, because if all we're going to get out of COVID, and if all we're going to get out of the lessons of COVID globally is a few more gestures whereby we try and build back better, or some of the stuff which is being selected by the Wellbeing Alliance and organisations on. If that's all we're going to get, then quite honestly, Scotland and Scottish democracy is failing the people of Scotland.
Yeah, I mean, I thought it was interesting that in his evidence, Alex Salmond said, he said, you know, the various institutions haven't failed, their leadership has failed. And I felt like he was trying to protect what has long been his argument about Scottish independence, which was, and he used to say this, he used to say, Scottish independence is simply extending the Scotland Act to every area. You know, it's just a full accomplishment of the devolution project, which I always thought was dubious, and I always thought would cause problems as a conception of what the independence movement is, that it's just permanent devolution forever. Because I thought we needed to be honest and say, no, we're establishing a new state, and that's a very different state of affairs. But he seems to want to protect the integrity of the existing institutions, and I felt like he was trying to get off the hook a bit by saying, well, it's just the leadership of these institutions that have failed. It doesn't look like that.
Well, of course, a lot of the institutional framework Alex himself was responsible for creating. So it's obviously a bit difficult for him to criticize too severely the institutional framework that we've got. But you see, again, not to go into all the details of what's happened over the past couple of weeks, but just think about it. Just think about it. We've got some very serious questions affecting life in Scotland and the governance of Scotland, which still really haven't been answered. We've got the extension of the harassment procedure to former ministers, still very unclear about that. We've got various meetings between Nicola Sturgeon and other people, still very unclear about that. We had the apparently deliberate leaking to the data record, still very unclear about that. Still very unclear about why the Scottish government chose to persist, resisting the judicial inquiry until the last possible minute, whereby they could withdraw. And there's a whole host of other things as well. Now, the worrying thing about all of this is that there have been 2 separate votes by the Scottish Parliament as a whole to produce all of the evidence. There have been countless letters by the inquiry to produce all of the evidence. We've had Lady Dorian's statement saying that, you know, it's okay to produce the evidence. We had the mysterious midnight redactions by the Lord Advocate. We had the vote of confidence from the Tories in John Swinney, which finally produced a bit more evidence. But we had various members of the inquiry panel saying, even during this week, that they still haven't had all of the evidence that they've been asking for. And quite honestly, when you've got some very fundamental questions like this about the behaviour of the Scottish government and the possible spending of something like £1 million in the judicial review by the Scottish government, if after a couple of parliamentary votes, all of the letters from the inquiry, Lady Dorian, and all of the bits and pieces, including a vote of confidence in the deputy leader, if despite all of that, despite the size of the issues that we're facing, the inquiry still hasn't seen all of the evidence that it's seeking to get, you know, what chance have we got for Scottish democracy? What chance have we got for Scottish democracy? You see, move on a tiny bit. Hopefully Scotland will still get independence, and I'm obviously very concerned that anything that's going on at the moment mustn't be allowed to damage the cause of independence. But if we move on a tiny bit further, Scotland's going to get its own army, its own defence forces. It's going to get its own intelligence services. I mean, I would hate to think that the rest of the sort of institutional framework and all of the systems of governance that Scotland is going to hopefully achieve when it gets independence is going to be run in the same way as we're seeing things run now. I think, quite honestly, that's almost a terrifying prospect. It certainly isn't democracy. I mean, various people in London, the sort of people that you would expect to have called it a banana republic without the bananas. I mean, that's not quite my description. But I have to say, what we're seeing could hardly be described as democracy and accountability.
Yeah, I agree with that. And in our last conversation, we said that one of the most worrying aspects of all this was the absence of an independent civic sphere willing to criticise, or who felt that it was appropriate to criticise. And to be honest, the last week just peaked that situation. I mean, there are some honourable exceptions, you know, people in the media sphere, for example, who are willing to be balanced or to take shots at both sides or whatever. But overwhelmingly, people who are willing to be critical of Nicola Sturgeon did so from the point of view of a quite unthinking loyalty to Alex Salmond, the person. But the vast majority of people who were working in the media, I mean, I saw journalists, for example, some of whom, you know, I've got, you know, some respect for and so on, but I saw journalists tweeting things like, well, say what else you like about Nicola Sturgeon, but she's very empathetic. And I thought, This is not an appropriate thing to be saying about someone, you know, who's under investigation for really, really serious things. And there was almost, you know, and you had chains of journalists, for example, talking about how personable Nicola Sturgeon was, and that she was, you know, kind of forthright and honest, and she was a nice person and all this kind of stuff. Quite kind of unseemly stuff. The other person who surprised me, I probably shouldn't be surprised, was Hamza Yusuf, who's the Justice Secretary, live tweeting the entire 8 hours, you know, and sort of cheering from the sidelines like a football fan. I mean, that's
well, if I may say so, you've taken my next sentence from me, because what I was going to say, despite all of these, which are very significant issues, I mean, this is not tiddly push stuff. This is big stuff. It's about the Scottish government possibly wasting up to £1 million after a very faulty inquiry procedure, after a whole lot of other things, which quite honestly, and I'm not going to go through them all now, do raise some very serious questions about the way that Scotland is run. But despite all of this, we've had hardly a flicker from SNP, MPs and MSPs, hardly a flicker. And if you saw the Twitter chorus, the Twitter barrage, and I'm not just talking about Hamza Yusuf, although I have to say that seriously, I think that the Hamza Yusuf thing could be a breach of parliamentary privilege. This is the Justice Secretary. This is the Justice Secretary who has responsibility for some of the issues which are being considered by the inquiry. I know that he's not the head of Scotland's judicial system, that's the Lord Advocate, that's the Crown Office, but this is the Justice Secretary who has some responsibility for some of the issues being considered by the panel, actually tweeting during the panel, having a go at panel members. Now, I think, quite honestly, that is a breach of the privilege of the Scottish Parliament inquiry and its members.
It was certainly strange to watch, and I did think, you know, why isn't there more control being operated in at the top of the government? Why weren't ministers told to stay away from, you know, and let the committee simply do its job? Yeah, very odd state of affairs. Let's try and move this on then to because you've said, and I think it's very true, that in the independence movement, we have to take these issues very seriously, because we're talking about the establishment of a new state with the agencies that would imply, and therefore it can't be a secondary issue to us how the state currently functions or dysfunctions in Scotland. I mean, more broadly, how do we move on from this kind of tawdry affair and give the independence movement back, you know, a kind of credibility and a kind of democratic and open kind of aspect? Because in theory, at least, this is an independence election. I have to say the stuff that I've seen the SNP put out so far suggests that it will actually be a referendum on Nicola Sturgeon's personality, or handling of the pandemic, and of course in polls there's a lot of support for Sturgeon and a handling of the pandemic. I think for dubious reasons, to be honest. I mean, people have preferred Sturgeon over Westminster's handling, but broadly speaking,
but that's the way that Charlotte Street Partners would love to play the whole thing. And that's already the way in which the SNP is playing the whole thing. It's some kind of validation of Nicola Sturgeon, her handling of COVID, even her performance at the inquiry. It's all about, you know, Nicola is okay, support Nicola. And that's really what they would dearly love the election to be all about. Okay, I mean, obviously that's coupled with independence, but I mean, underneath all of that, and we've said this many times before, both of us, is a complete and utter lack of any sign of progressive policies. It's letting down the people of Scotland very badly. We've got some serious things happening in consequence from COVID. We got some very serious things happening in terms of poverty, education. There's a whole range of issues that I could go through, but I really haven't seen any sign of positive policies emerging from all of this. But let me just go back to the historical parallels. And again, I'm probably a bit before you. Go back to the Paulson-Cunningham days in the Northeast in the 1970s and 1980s. That was one party rule by Labour throughout the whole of the Northeast. Okay, it ultimately produced Blair when I was there, but I mean before that we had Paulson, we had Andy Cunningham, John Cunningham's dad, running all of the Labour-controlled councils throughout the Northeast. They were told what they were going to do. They were told who was going to build their council houses. They were told who was going to be the architect and all the other sorts of bits and pieces. There was a complete lack of democracy, and if I may say so, a heck of a lot of corruption for which some people went to prison. That was what ultimately ended up with one-party rule in the Northeast in the 1970s and 1980s. Go back to the way in which the Braddocks ran Liverpool before the tendency appeared on the scene. And of course, it was the Braddocks that actually caused the militant tendency in Liverpool during the 1980s. Again, complete one-party rule. And again, you got all the corruption, you got all the handing out of contracts and all the other sorts of bits and pieces. That's unfortunately the kind of precedence in which Scotland is now following. And as I say, that worries me particularly. It's not only the sort of stuff that the Scottish government has got responsibility for now, and okay, it doesn't have complete responsibility for everything, but once we get an independent state, as I say, we're going to have our own defence forces, we're going to have our own version of MI5, we're going to get Scottish spy cops and all the other sorts of stuff. And I have to say that having any of that controlled by the present entourage, the present ensemble that you've got running things in Scotland, frightens people like me to death. It really does.
Our coverage this week is called Beyond Salmond and Sturgeon, or Independence Beyond Salmond and Sturgeon. And the idea is, and I think a lot of people haven't caught up with this yet, but it is genuinely my assumption. First of all, it's an historic thing. Salmond and Sturgeon were a unit for a long time, and that unit, was created our current political situation. And they share a very common vision and policy platform and all this. Part of the strange thing about the infighting in the SNP is it's between two factions with remarkably similar politics and a remarkably similar outlook, including, by the way, I mean, obviously under Salmonds, the leadership was highly centralized and opaque and so on. And Sturgeon is simply the inheritor of that style of rule. But I mean, I think we have to view them as a joint phase in the development of Scottish politics. And my assumption is that phase probably comes to an end within a couple of years. I don't think that Sturgeon will still be the First Minister by the end of the coming term. And I don't think we will have had an independence referendum either. I certainly don't think.
Let me say, you may not be wrong on that. But don't forget, even if Nicola goes, we will still, whoever's in charge, will still have a very strong centralised political control. Until SNP members of the party actually get control of the party, we're still going to have a situation where somebody like Morell, somebody like the present hierarchy, rigidly controls most of the constituencies, rigidly controls access to anybody getting a seat in the Scottish Parliament. Hopefully the Westminster Parliament will no longer be necessary, but nevertheless, all of the access to all of that and all of the way in which all of that works is controlled by the Morell magpie machine. It really is. Now, that leaves the interesting question of the list, because the list is the only part of Scottish democracy that Morell doesn't control. And what I think is very interesting about the list is that, okay, some people now have started to get quite interested in the list, but from the way in which they're going about it, I mean, I'm not questioning individuals, and I would like to get into discussion with them. I think there are possibilities on the list, But where we've got people saying, well, don't vote SNP for the list, vote one of the independents for independence or whatever it's going to be, I'm not quite sure they understand the way the list works. For a start, the SNP has only got 4 list MSPs. One of them's in Highlands and Islands, Marie Todd, and the other 3 are in the south of Scotland. And some of the people who were standing as independents for Scotland, and obviously not in the SNP, are not going to stand in the south of Scotland, and I don't think they're going to stand in the Highlands and Islands. So even people considering the list have really got to have a much more serious look at the possibilities of the list. If you have a look at the what happened to Rise candidates and what happened to other independence candidates, even in Glasgow, which is the best possible place, I suppose, to stand on the list if you're not in one of the main parties, you'll find that, frankly, the vote for list candidates who were not Tories, not Lib Dems, not SNP, not Labour, even in Glasgow, quite honestly, was very, very small, very, very small. So there's a whole lot of examination that we've got to do, frankly, if we're thinking about the list. And as I say, whether we like it or not, the list is the main part of Scottish democracy that the Morel machine doesn't control. But I really do think that, well, first of all, it opens some possibilities. It opens some possibilities. But whether we're going to be able to put together any kind of strategy for voting on the list before the 6th of May, I've got my doubts.
Yeah, I do as well. I don't think there's a chance of any of these small list parties making a break into the Scottish Parliament. I suspect, I mean, predictions are a mug's game, famously, but I mean, I suspect there will be a very strong showing for the SNP, and I suspect a very strong showing for the Greens. I'm not going to make predictions beyond that. I mean, I think that a majority pro-independence parliament is very likely, or I should probably just say very possible, but it certainly is. I mean, the opposition remains completely fractured and useless and leaderless. I mean, there isn't a serious leader on the unionist side in Scottish politics, which is quite a remarkable reality 14 years after the SNP came to power. They still haven't been able to put up a single serious leader in response to the SNP hegemony. I mean, Ruth Davidson, there was a whole lot of sound and fury around Ruth Davidson. She was never up to it, and now she's away to the House of Lords. So the unionist wing, if you like, of Scottish politics is in a really desperate state. Labour, clearly, most of all. So yeah, I still think we're looking at a pro-indie parliament at Holyrood. To be honest, and I want to hear if this is what the wavelength you're on. I suspect that we're in for a much longer game here. I mean, what part of the reason I'm not totally depressed and despondent about Scottish politics is I think there's time to heal the problems. I think there's time to sort out the issues, including, for example, the Growth Commission stuff, stylisation, all of that mess, which I don't think, I mean, Sturgeon shows absolutely no consideration even of dropping any of these very conservative parts of her programme. She can't, in a way, her leadership is tied to it. My assumption is that, let's say in a couple of years' time, Angus Robertson has taken over the SNP. I mean, he looks like the person who's being set up for the succession. I mean, I don't think he's any more politically left-wing than Nicola Sturgeon is. He's very much associated with the right of the party. But perhaps on sheer competence grounds, he will take that as an opportunity to ditch some of the more odious stuff in the Growth Commission. And on top of that, there is the fact that economics is changing on a world scale. So, I mean, I think that we're in for years of potentially reforging.
I'm not disagreeing. If you have a look at some of the instruments, have a look at some of the mechanisms. I'm not giving up on the list. I think that, as I say, because the list is the only part of democracy in Scotland that the Morel machine can't control. And that's a constitutional mechanism. It's not a mechanism that's decided by the SNP, and its candidates aren't decided by the SNP. So it's something that they can't control. I still think that is worth having a look at much more carefully. I still don't think we understand enough about the way that the ONT system works, about the way the list system works. I've had a look at the various spreadsheets, for example, that were produced in 2016 by Spice and by the Scottish Parliament. I think there's some very interesting stuff there, very interesting stuff. So we need to get our heads around the way that the ONT system works in various regional lists, and we need to have a look at that much more seriously. We need to have a look at the unions. I'm an active member of Unite, and obviously the UCU. I'm in the University and College Union. And okay, we've got some possibilities in both of those, but I have to say that my own union, Unite, is still predominantly a unionist union. It's the same with Unison, it's the same with a lot of the others. They are still predominantly unionist unions being led from London. And despite the fact that I'm pretty damn sure we can improve on some of the offers which are being made on public sector pay in London at the moment. If we talk about health service workers and all of the other nonsense that we've got from Johnson, I'm pretty sure that we can improve on that, and we could improve on it even more if we ran all of that ourselves. So I think we can make inroads into some of the trade unions, and hopefully we could get more pressure from some of the unions and indeed the STUC for independence. But the other thing I think we need seriously to have a look at is the composition of the National Executive Committee of the SNP. The National Executive Committee of the SNP is the main way in which SNP members ought to gain more control of the party. It's far too big. It needs some kind of examination of the structure, and we ought to be able to get to a situation for the National Executive Committee of the SNP where we talk about putting up slates. That happens in the Labour Party. And if we could start to democratise the SNP in that way, if we could join that with more pressure for independence coming particularly from the public sector unions, and it's in the public sector unions' own interests that we get independence, because there's no way that public sector unions are going to get anything approaching a reasonable deal from Johnson and Co. And similarly, if we can have a much more serious look at the list, I think we've got some possibilities. Now, if arising from all of that, we could put together a fairly, I won't call it minimalist, but we could put together some sort of basic set of policy demands. We need seriously to return the NHS to becoming an entirely publicly provided service. Not only free at the point of use, which is the get out, but we need to return the NHS to becoming an entirely freely provided service. It's the same with the care service as well, adult social care and all of the other bits and pieces. I would have thought that that was a pretty minimal demand that we could get a whole range of people coupled into. Same with education, We've got a lot of things happening with education at the moment, and okay, we're obviously going to get problems with rural education because of Scotland's very rurally diverse population. But there's all sorts of ways in which we've learned to deliver education in new ways now during COVID. So I think we need to have a much more fundamental look at the way in which we deliver education to the poorer communities, because they are not getting their fair share at all. It's not just about putting more money in. It's about outreach, it's about support. Dare I say, it's almost a sort of sure start approach for the public delivery of primary and secondary education. I teach in higher education. I mean, I teach at Glasgow Caledonian. I can see what we can do for our students. I could see what we could do for our students if we had more resource, if we had more support that we could give to our students. But quite honestly, none of that has moved on at all. None of that has moved on at all since we've had a Scottish government since 1999. We are still delivering all of that in the same basic way that a UK government would have done even if we hadn't had devolution. So there's a whole lot of stuff in education that we ought to be talking about in a fairly minimal way. There's a whole lot of other public services that I think we could put forward some pretty minimum demands for, minimal demand. And as I say, if we could get the unions signed up to that, if we could get some list candidates signed up to that, if we could get some people standing for the SNP National Executive Committee signed up to that, I think that's the kind of way that we can try and make a bit more progress. But I have to say, unless we don't do that, if we don't do that, I can see that what we're talking about and what we're arguing for, it's going to take a heck of a long time, if at all, to achieve.
Yeah, I mean, that is the worry, isn't it? I mean, besides the obvious with public services underperforming, part of the worry is that people will start to say, well, the democracy doesn't work particularly well, the schools don't work particularly well, the hospitals seem to be a bit of a mess. Why should I want this to become an independent state and simply institutionalize these dysfunctions? So I agree with you. I mean, I don't think these are separate questions at all. I think, and I think a lot of, you sometimes get a kind of political quietism thing in the independence movement where people say, we'll get independence and then we can talk about policy and we can talk about, we can talk about the politics. But then, of course, these things are totally organically linked. Whether we get independence or not is totally linked to all of the wider panoply of political questions facing the society.
When we were doing the campaign for Labour Party democracy in the 1970s and 1980s, and obviously we were talking about things like the mandatory reselection of members of parliament. We were talking about the National Executive Committee having the right to write the Labour Party manifesto. We were talking about a lot of constitutional reforms that we wanted to see put in place to give party members, constituency parties, far more control over the general direction of the party. People used to keep saying to us, but why do you keep on about this constitutional stuff? And our very, very simple answer used to be, and it's the same that we've got to give people in Scotland now, unless we get the constitutional stuff right, we are never going to get the progressive policies. That's my worry. People just don't seem to understand that. As long as we continue with Scotland's ruling elite, then quite honestly, we're going to continue with the same kind of North British neoliberal policies that we've had in Scotland since 1999.
Okay, Les, thanks very much for your thoughts again. Lots there to think about, and yeah, thanks for speaking to me again. And it's always great hearing about all the local intrigues and so on in the Labour Party in England. I don't really know anything about the history of all these things. It's interesting to me partly because it just reminds me of the story of Labour in Glasgow, But a fascinating trajectory that keeps replicating itself in kind of centre-left political organisations. So yeah, lots to think about there, Les. Thanks very much.
No, David, thanks for having me. Nice to be here. Thank you.
Yeah, I'll look forward to speaking to you again soon.
Okay, thanks.
Yeah, so go to conter.co.uk. Where you can find our coverage this week on the aftermath of the scandal in Scottish politics, what it means for the independence movement, how we move on and reforge an effective independence movement in the coming months and years. Thanks for joining us, and I look forward to speaking to you all again soon.